So today I'll be looking at the pioneers that were from the early, modern and contemporary periods while looking at their famous films and editing techniques. What is editing? Editing is when an editor cuts out the unwanted and unnecessary pieces of footage from a film that the filmmakers had to make over the course of a few months in which they had to meet a deadline. This is done in the post-production stage in the film industry. The first pioneer from the early cinema was the Lumiere brothers. In the early 1895, they invented the cinematograph. But this piece of equipment was smaller than Tom Edison's kinetograph, weighing at 5 kilograms, and it had 16 frames per second less than Tom's kinetograph, which meant that it was slower. Towards the end of 1895, they released their first short film called Workers Leaving the Lumiere Factory on the 28th of December, which included 10 other short films in a private screening session in the Grand Café in Paris. A year later, they released another short documentary film called Arrival of the Train. The Lumiere brothers did not have any techniques, so they did not invent how to edit, so they had to film a certain location in 10 minutes, made it long to watch, and as the reel had 10 minutes. The second pioneer of early cinema is Georges Méliès. Georges Méliès was one of the pioneers who started to lead the technical techniques in early cinema. On the 28th of December 1895, he was part of the audience that saw the private screening session in the Lumiere brothers' 10 short films at the Grand Café in Paris. He wanted to buy the cinematograph from the brothers, but they said no to him as they were fearful they had potential and could give them competition. Despite all of that, they bought an English-made projector which reversed the mechanics and created its own camera, and called it an animatograph. His famous films were The Haunted Castle in 1896 and The Trip to the Moon in 1902. His editing techniques came around when, in 1896, he was shooting in Paris of a bus coming out of a tunnel in which his camera got jammed, and after getting the camera working again, the bus was gone and filmed a hearse. When developing the film, he made a shocking discovery when the bus turned into a hearse, which we call it today a jump cut. That technique of the jump cut went to develop further when Godard used it in his film Breathless, which I'll get onto later. After discovering this, he started putting in his work, which was The Haunted Castle, where he created disappearing and reappearing effects. He would also went on to discover fade-in or fade-out, overlapping dissolves, and stop-motion photography, which could be described as special effects. Méliès was starting to push the boundaries in terms of films, which was from single action shots into a narrative storytelling. Another pioneer from early cinema is Edwin S. Porter. Edwin S. Porter was another pioneers from early cinema. At Vindoscope, he was essential to the organization of their projected movie show in New York City in 1896. Before then, he had created a film projector. He went on to make great films like Life of the American Fireman and The Great Chain Robbery, but did make over 250 films. The editing technique that Porter discovered was splicing to make temporal overlaps, going from one scene to another, which cuts the time. Where in Life of the American Fireman, the opening shot is when all the firemen rush down the pole, and followed by another shot at the bottom pole just before they land, which could be described as a mini flashback. Again, was another one of those early pioneers and one of the most famous directors as well. While working at Biograph, he made 3 short films that were in the same year, which was The Adventures of the Dolly, Greaser's Gauntlet, and Many After Years in 1908, with Many Years, which was held as a masterpiece by critics. A year later, he released another film called The Lonely Villa in 1909. While working in the Biograph company, he would make over 450 films, which pushed the film industry out of the temporary mentality into a multi-short medium that we know today. By 1911, he was ready to pursue bigger and ambitious projects. He decided to go on his own after Biograph didn't want to work with him anymore, and they couldn't afford how much the projects were going to be. By 1915, he released a worldwide blockbuster and most costly movie called Birth of a Nation, which was critically acclaimed by audiences, but it was deemed as extremely racist. In 1916, he released another film called Intolerance, which cost nearly $2.5 million to make, but again, it was critically acclaimed by audiences and critics. His editing technique started at Greaser's Gauntlet, where Griffiths first developed the cut-in shot. A cut-in shot is when it shows an object in further detail, and this was seen in the film, where the shot cuts out from a medium-long shot of a tree hanging into a full shot in the middle of the scene between 2 characters. This does create an emotional impact between them in the film. Another editing technique he developed was cross-cutting, where he cuts cuts between shots in different scenes in an action, and used in the film in Lightning Villa, where he cuts the shot quickly to build up tempo until it has reached a cinematic climax. He also developed continuity editing. This particular style is where it maintains its space and time. But when using multiple cameras, he would develop the 180-degree rule, stubbling shots, eyeline matching, shot reverse shot, and cutting on action, which these techniques are linked with continuity, but the techniques were developed from trial and error as he wanted to see. Now we move on to the side of the Russian side of the films, which I'm going to be talking about the montage technique, and also to see what the emotions of the perspective of one character. Montage is where you can change the shots not only to get a different meaning, but also to make the audience think of what's going on in the film. Les Kuleshov was a Soviet Russian filmmaker and theorist who looked at the psychological workings of motion picture. He was involved in founding the VGIK, Warren Union State Institute of Cinematograph. The traditional setting of the school did not suit his work style, so he was given his own study group called the Kuleshov Workshop, which worked outside the school film. He came up with the theory of montage, which is another editing technique. In May of 1919, D.W. Griffith's Intolerance was shown across the Soviet Union due to the demand by Vladimir Lenin, who at the time was a political theorist. Not only did Intolerance became the most important film being watched in the Soviet Union in the next 10 years, it became the subject of deep study at Kuleshov's workshop. They examined D.W. Griffith's editing technique by deconstructing and reassembling shots in many different ways as possible to see the impact the editor had on films. Kuleshov was ready to expert with lessons he took from studying from D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, and the first experiment he did became known as the Kuleshov effect. Kuleshov had the theory that if he changed the order of the shots, it would change the meaning behind the film. In an expert, he took 3 shots of an actor smiling, a close-up of a gun, and an actor looking frightened. But when it was showed to the audience, the meaning behind it was that the actor was looking fearful. But when he changed the shots, the audience had a different reaction and opinion to what the actor's emotions were. This only showed that his theory of montage works, and is being used by some films today. Another Soviet pioneer was Sergei Eisenstein. Sergei Eisenstein was one of the most famous Russian silent filmmakers and briefly studied at Kuleshov's workshop. In 1925, he released a short film called The Battleship Potemkin, which became his most critically acclaimed and most influential film in history. It celebrated the 20th anniversary of 1905's revolution against the Tsar. He had a different style of storytelling because he used montage, or in other words, alternative technique. He became the first person to put the theory of montage into film. He also came up with 5 methods of montage. Metric, cutting to the beat of a soundtrack being played in the background. Rhythmic does include rhythmic method, but it does change the pace when the shots cut to another. Tonal, that means it has an emotional feeling to the shots. Overtonal, where the use of metric, rhythmic, and tonal methods, it creates an effect for the audience watching the film. And finally, intellectual, when there are different shots in the film, it does. This is where all the modern period directors took all the influences of the early cinema and put it into their own films. Alfred Hitchcock was one of the most famous English directors who contributed to the developments of editing, but in the modern period of cinema, he was influenced by the montage technique that was developed and used in films by Eisenstein, but it was developed by Kuleshov. Considered an auteur, or in English, artist, by French critic turned filmmakers, as they were influenced by his work. His editing techniques that he used those montage techniques that Eisenstein used in his films. In the shower scene, the cycle, a man is stabbed to death by an unknown assailant, which the method of montage being used is rhythmic, as the pace of each scene is where she's getting stabbed was at slower pace, but did increase through the cuts of the sequence. After she's fully stabbed and the unknown assailant leaves the bathroom, there is a shot of the bulb plug with blood going down the drain, and also after that there's a cross dissolve where there is a long close-up on Marilyn's right eye, which could be described as a cross dissolve, because it is really showing that she's nearing a death due to the fact there is blood going down the buff plug. Moving on to from Hitchcock is Godard. Jean-Luc Godard was one of the most famous French filmmakers and also led the new wave movement. That means this is a different way of storytelling, but to make the audience, not to make the audience watching these new wave films to think about their own lives, which included emotions, etc. And his famous films that he made was Breathless in 1960. Godard did use editing techniques of the jump cut, where this technique came from Georges Méliès and used in his films of Breathless, which meant that Godard developed the use of jump cuts being used in his films. The jump cuts in Breathless appear at the beginning of the film, where one of the characters is driving a stolen car on the road until he starts getting chased by police officers on bikes. The reason why he uses this technique in the film because he's an artist, an auteur in French, meaning he wanted to create. This was meaning that he wanted to create his own style and also wanted to give America's continuity a challenge as they were dominating the film industry. Due to the fact there was a use of jump cuts and breath, that means that continuity was getting broken. There was another word for continuity, which is discontinuity. This is where you break continuity that Americans use in their films. Stanley Kubrick was another famous filmmaker and director who contributed to the developments of editing in the modern period. He was influenced by Godard for the use of jump cuts and known for making a weird film. He made some famous films like Dr. Strangelove in 1960, 2001 Space Odyssey in 1968, A Clockwork Orange in 1971, and this was considered his weird film. One of his editing techniques that he uses was less dialogue in Space Odyssey than in his other films, like Dr. Strangelove and Clockwork Orange, which both of these films use a lot of dialogue, and which is the audience will easily understand what is going on in the film. In one of the famous scenes of Space Odyssey, where the gorilla throws a bone in the sky, where the shot goes in slow motion of the bone in the air, and there's a jump cut of the satellite flying around in space. But this particular jump cut in the film is important as it's showing the evolution of man, where they came from apes, which evolved to man going into space.